And on a special Memorial Day edition of the Daily Wrap, veterans are angry at GOP members who are trying to distance themselves from the Iraq War. Journalist Bob Woodward defends President Bush's claims that Iraq had WMDs. The Democratic Party tweets an interesting photo in remembrance of Memorial Day. And our own Rick Unger hits the streets to quiz New Yorkers on the true meaning of Memorial Day in a sequel you won't want to miss. We've got all that, plus potluck and yay or nay. This is the Daily Wrap, live from New York City. And welcome to the show. I'm Joe Concha, and joining me is Sirius XM radio host, columnist, and Steve Malzberg's Mariano Rivera coming out of the pen for hour number 4 on this network. My co-host, Rick Unger. Looking spry still.
Yeah, it's still there.
To his right, she is the author of the brand new book, Femvangelical, The Modern Girl's Guide to the Good News. Reverend Jenny Crumpton is back. And finally, former Navy SEAL, former FBI Special Agent, and president of Continued Services LLC, and friend of the Daily Wrap, and apparently immersed in the new Jenny Crumpton book.
And who knew he could read?
Oh boy. Jonathan Gilliam's here. Let's get right to the Daily Download. And on this Memorial Day Monday, a day when we honor our service members who died in the line of duty, some veterans are showing their displeasure with 2016 Republican candidates. Some are upset that the candidates are distancing themselves from their decision to go to the war in Iraq. Here's Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio in the past couple of weeks.
If we're all supposed to answer hypothetical questions, knowing what we know now, what would you have done? I would have not engaged. I would not have gone into Iraq.
We've learned subsequently that that information was wrong, and my answer was, well, if at the time it would have been apparent that the intelligence was wrong, I don't think George Bush would have moved forward on the invasion.
Now, some vets are annoyed that a party that lobbied so hard for the war is now running from it. Others say they still believe their mission was vital, regardless of what the politicians say. What's your reaction when you hear the Republican candidates distancing themselves from the Iraq War, Jonathan Gilliam?
Well, I think once you make a decision, a command decision like that, you have to stick with it. And you own the decision and you own the outcome of it. And I think really if these candidates really wanted to impress people, they would own the decision to go in there and they would say it didn't turn out the way that we thought it was going to turn out. We lost our focus. We did not have a strategic war plan that had a long-term vision. And I think if that's what they were saying, the American people would be really getting behind that. I've always found that a leader that owns their command decision, that sticks with it, and then owns their, not just what they do well, which candidates always want to own that part of it, but also own the issues that you had or the downfalls or the mistakes that you made. Own those and then speak to that, what we've learned from it. I'm not hearing that from anybody. I'm just hearing them say we shouldn't have gone.
I read a poll fairly recently that said 22% of all Americans say that it was a mistake to go. I'm sorry, 22% say that we never, what am I trying to say here? 22% agree with the fact that we went into Iraq. And it seems that probably these politicians, and particularly on the GOP side, are reading these polls and saying, okay, if that's where the tea leaves are,
you know how I feel about polls.
Yeah.
I just think that this country is looking for leaders, and they need to stop looking at polls. The people want a leader to say, listen, this is what we decided to do. It worked here, it didn't work here, and this is a problem that we have now. You know, saying that a poll is one way or the other doesn't really tell anybody anything.
Look, I mean, Jonathan is right when he talks about the poor execution of the war. I agree with that completely. The issue, though, is these politicians, these Republicans, are not being asked about the execution. They're being asked about whether or not they would have done it in the first place.
Knowing what we
know now, right? So there's no way to get around the fact an error is an error is an error. I have nothing but sympathy for the veterans who fought in that war and are now left to face the question, did we need to be there in the first place? You know, not only the people who fortunately survived it, but my goodness, the people who didn't survive it or who survived it in terrible shape. It's a horrible thing for them to have to confront, but that doesn't mean that we as a nation can afford to simply pretend that we did the right thing. Look, the biggest problem here is that when you go into a war for the wrong reasons, you fight a bad war. When it's time to fight a good war, and I happen to think we're at that time, I happen to think we should be more involved in fighting ISIS. It becomes very hard to take the people with you because all they remember is all the suffering from the war that we shouldn't have fought, and they don't want to go do it again. There's a large consequence, not just in making mistakes and causing unnecessary deaths and putting our soldiers in the line of danger as we did to them, but you lose the support of the public when it comes time for what might be a right war.
That's why when people say that the country is war weary, they're really not war weary. They're weary from bad decisions and keeping us in areas where we don't have a vision for of what we're really fighting.
Right. And I think when Megyn Kelly actually asked Jeb Bush that question in the first place a couple of weeks ago, as a journalist, she was very tuned in to the fact that, like you said, the people are looking for leaders who are concerned with the billions of dollars we're spending on wars, with the terrible atrocity that is military suicide, that is just at epidemic levels. You know, Americans are looking for people, I think now, who can admit their mistakes and are willing to flip-flop. You know, the media still persecutes politicians for flip-flopping, but, you know, Hillary Clinton has also come out and said, I made a mistake by voting for that war. It wasn't the right thing to do. I think we're in an age where people are wanting to see more honesty.
And of course, the decision to invade Iraq was based on the faulty intelligence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But journalist Bob Woodward, who reported extensively on the decision to go to war, is now pushing back on the narrative that President Bush lied about WMDs.
It was Bush telling George Tenet, the CIA director, don't let anyone stretch the case on WMD. And he was the one who was skeptical. A mistake certainly can be argued, and there's an abundance of evidence, but there was no lie in this that I could find.
Jonathan, you think that vindicates George W. Bush in any capacity when a respected journalist like Bob Woodward says, no, he wasn't really lying?
Well, and Bob Woodward's definitely one of those people that's in the know in a lot of these things. He has a lot of good sources in D.C. And I'll tell you, from a veteran's perspective, what I've researched and the guys that I know that went over to Iraq and came back, I wasn't in Iraq, but there was definitely something there at the beginning of that my personal belief is that there probably was WMDs that got moved. Where could they have gotten moved? It would have been as easy as Syria. I mean, where they do have chemical weapons and biological weapons now. I think that politics, again, got involved with that whole thing. And it just didn't, even if there were WMDs, there was no strategic long-term plan for it.
Correct.
Here's the problem. First of all, Woodward may be right on a technicality. He is a great journalist. I'm sure he's telling the truth. But that doesn't change the fact that many high-up people in that administration were selling the story about Saddam Hussein trying to get yellow cake from Nigeria to make nuclear weapons.
Including Colin Powell.
Exactly, who went in front of the Security Council and made that whole pitch.
But do you think that Powell knowingly lied?
No, I don't think he knowingly lied. I think he was given bad information. Now, the WMD argument, you hear that a lot, and I agree with you, Jonathan. I think there's truth to that. But it's not, they didn't sell us the war on the notion of having sarin gas buried in the desert or any number of other weapons that you could call WMD. Right. And I think you're probably right. I think they were there. I think we found evidence of that. I think they were shipped out. I think you got that exactly right. That's not how they sold the war. They sold it on Saddam Hussein going for a nuclear program, not those. And that's the lie.
Jen.
You know, I think being skeptical, as Woodward says about Bush, is very different from lying. But the point of it is not whether George Bush lied about it. It's about the decision he made. It's about the lack of responsibility as a leader to looking into what was really happening. You know, a lot of the CIA has actually been speaking out now that this has resurfaced again, talking about their role and the type of intelligence they gather and the nuances of it. So I think he was just, He needs to admit that he was just surrounded by people who pushed him into a war that, as Woodward called it, kept getting better and easier. And if you're looking at what's better and easier, you're not looking at the right information.
And that'll be the last word on that. Coming up next, wait until you see how the Democratic Party remembered Memorial Day on the Twitter. Keep it right here. Special Memorial Day edition of the Daily Wrap. Back with more in a moment.